There is a clay tablet in the British Museum in the Mesopotamian gallery on the upper floor that does something no other ancient Near Eastern composition is known to do. It does not record a king. It does not list temple offerings. It does not narrate a creation. It tells the reader, in its own closing lines, that whoever copies the tablet and keeps it in his house will be spared when the destruction comes. Text spans 5 tablets of cuneiform Akkadian, recovered in fragments from the libraries of Nineveh, excavated under Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the 1840s and 1850s. The major pieces have been in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection ever since. Scholars call it the Era Epic, sometimes Era and Isham, and it is the only major Mesopotamian composition that ends with an explicit instruction for its own survival. It is called the Era Epic. And what happened when serious scholars decided to read that closing instruction not as poetic flourish, but as what it appears to be? A written warning against an expected event is one of the strangest and most under-discussed episodes in modern Assyriology. Physical tablets, as objects, are not very old by Mesopotamian standards. Clay itself dates to the late Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, roughly the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The scribes who pressed the wedges into the wet clay were working some 1200 years after the events the text appears to describe. The 5 tablets together run to roughly 750 lines. They are not a single artifact but a set, and the British Museum holds multiple copies and fragmentary duplicates, recovered from at least 3 separate find spots in northern Mesopotamia. Additional fragments exist in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad and the Suleymaniye Museum in Iraqi Kurdistan. The most complete editions were assembled by collating these scattered pieces against each other, line by line, across roughly a century of decipherment work. Composition is internally attributed to a scribe named Kabti Ilani Marduk, who is named in the text itself as having received the entire poem in a dream. Detail is unusual. Most Mesopotamian literary works are anonymous or attributed to deities. The Era Epic identifies a specific human author, names him, and tells the reader that the poem was delivered to him whole, in a single night by the god Isham. The story the text tells is, in summary, this. The god Era, sometimes identified with Nergal, the lord of plague and the underworld, has been asleep. He is awakened by 7 divine beings called the Sabiti, often translated as the Seven, who urge him to action. Tell him that humanity has grown numerous, noisy, irreverent. They convince him that destruction is necessary. Era goes to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, and persuades him to leave his throne briefly, so that Marduk's image may be restored. While Marduk is away, Era takes the opportunity to unleash devastation. Cities burn, rivers are dammed and redirected, populations are destroyed. The destruction is described in concrete geographical terms, named cities, named regions, named peoples. After the catastrophe, the god Ishum, Era's herald, persuades him to stop. Poem ends with a colophon, a closing passage, that tells the reader that the text itself is a charm. Whoever displays this tablet in his house, the colophon says, will not be touched by the destruction. Whoever recites it will be spared. The poem, in other words, claims to be its own protective device. The conventional dating of the events the poem describes places them in the 2nd millennium BCE. Not the time of the tablets themselves, but the time the events would have occurred if treated literally. The specific date most often pointed to by alternative researchers is approximately 2024 BCE, the year associated with the collapse of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, the fall of the great Sumerian heartland, and the abandonment of the southern Mesopotamian cities. This is the central thesis under examination here. The Era Epic on this reading is not myth. It is a survival manual composed in the centuries after a real catastrophe, preserving the memory of what destroyed the Sumerian world and instructing later generations on how to recognize the return of the same destructive forces. The analysis that produces this reading has been published. It has not been refuted on the specific points it raises, and the academic response to it has been, with very few exceptions, silence. If you find that the academic literature on artifacts like the Era epic has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records still sitting in museums waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe, only if that is the question you've been looking for. The rest of us continue. The mainstream scholarly reading of the Era epic is well established, well published, and worth stating fairly before anything else is said. The standard critical edition was produced by the Italian Assyriologist Luigi Cagni and published in Rome in 1969, with an English translation following in the early 1970s. The most accessible English version appears in Stephanie Dalley's volume Myths from Mesopotamia, published by Oxford University Press in 1989 and revised in 2000. Dalley, an Oxford Assyriologist, is among the most respected living translators of Akkadian literature. Wilfred G. Lambert, the late Birmingham Assyriologist, wrote extensively on the text. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary cites the Era epic throughout its volumes. The text is, in academic terms, fully integrated into the canon of Mesopotamian literature. The mainstream reading treats the poem as a literary response to political crisis. The conventional dating of the composition itself places it in the 8th century BCE, possibly during or shortly after the reign of the Babylonian king Eridu, or one of his successors. The cities the poem describes being destroyed: Babylon, Sippar, Der, Uruk, the Sutians, the people of the steppe, are, on this reading, references to actual disturbances in late Babylonian history. The destruction described is treated as a poetic intensification of real events, possibly the sack of Babylon by Assyrian forces, possibly the depredations of nomadic raiders in the centuries leading up to the poem's composition. Colophon, promising protection, is read as evidence that the text was used as an amulet, kept in private houses or hung on doorways in the manner of similar protective inscriptions known from late Babylonian and early Persian period Mesopotamia. The literature on protective texts in this period is substantial. The Era epic, on the mainstream reading, is one example among many. The figure of Era himself is conventionally interpreted as a personification of plague and warfare combined, a single divine figure who unifies what the Mesopotamians experienced as twin catastrophes, often arriving together. Sabiti, the seven, are identified by most Assyriologists with the 7 brightest stars of a constellation, possibly the Pleiades, though Lambert and others have suggested other identifications. Marduk's temporary departure from his throne is read as a literary device, explaining why disaster is permitted in a world ostensibly governed by a benevolent chief god. Ishum, the herald who calms Era, is read as a literary expression of restraint, a counterweight to the destructive impulse. The poem, on this reading, is religious literature in the precise sense. It is a meditation on the problem of evil, dressed in narrative form. This is the conventional reading. It is internally coherent. It is supported by a substantial body of scholarship in 3 languages. It does not require any of the events in the poem to have actually occurred, treats the colophon's protective promise as ritual language, consistent with other amulet texts of the period, and it has been the dominant interpretation for as long as the text has been fully translated. Anyone who pushes against this reading is pushing against 100 years of careful Assyriological work, and that work deserves to be acknowledged on its own terms before any alternative is proposed. The break in the conventional reading came from two directions at roughly the same time, and from researchers who were not part of the Assyriological establishment. First was Zechariah Sitchin, born in Baku in 1920, raised in Palestine, educated at the London School of Economics, and the author of a series of books, beginning with The 12th Planet in 1976. Sitchin had no doctorate in Assyriology, but he had taught himself to read cuneiform in the original, and he had spent decades sitting with the standard editions of the major Mesopotamian texts. He died in New York in 2010. His readings have been controversial throughout, but his treatment of the era epic specifically is one of the more carefully argued portions of his work, and it deserves to be evaluated on its own merits rather than dismissed on the basis of his other claims. Sitchin's central observation about the era epic was geographical. The cities and regions named in the destruction sequences are not random, or they are concentrated in southern Mesopotamia and the lands east of the Tigris. They include the Sumerian heartland, the cities of the Ur-3 Empire, and its immediate predecessors. They include the Sinai Peninsula, mentioned in the poem by terms Sitchin, read as describing a region of mountains and metalworking. They include Akkad, though Akkad by the time of the era epic's composition was a ruin whose exact location had already been lost. Pattern of destruction described: burning, the withering of vegetation, the poisoning of waters, the long-term abandonment of cultivated land. Matches, Sitchin argued. The archaeological signature of the Ur-3 collapse, approximately 2024 BCE. That collapse is well attested. Third dynasty of Ur, ruled by kings whose names appear on cuneiform records that scholars consider entirely historical. Ur-Nammu, Shulgi, Amar-Sin, Shu-Sin, Ibi-Sin, controlled an empire stretching across southern Mesopotamia for roughly a century. Within a generation, that empire was gone. The cities of Ur, Eridu, Larsa, Nippur, Uruk, Lagash were depopulated. Cultivation around them was abandoned. The soil records preserve a signature of salinization and agricultural failure dated by Chinese and Western radiocarbon work between approximately 2100 and 2000 BCE. The collapse is real. The mainstream explanation involves climate change, salinization of irrigation systems, and pressure from migrating Amorite peoples. The collapse is not in dispute. The question is whether the era epic records it. Sitchin's argument was that two later compositions called the Lamentation over the destruction of Ur and the Lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur describe the same events from the inside, composed within a generation of the catastrophe, before the memory had been mythologized. These lamentations are not in dispute as historical texts. They are translated in standard reference works. They describe an evil wind that swept across Sumer, killing without distinction, burning the temples, poisoning the air. Descriptions are vivid, specific, and disturbing. Sitchin read the era epic as a later poetic compression of the same events, composed some 1200 years after the fact, when the cause had been forgotten and only the warning remained. The colophon's protective instruction on this reading is not an amulet's standard formula. It is a deliberate instruction, preserved from a real disaster, transmitted across centuries by scribes who themselves no longer understood what they were transmitting. The second line of approach came from researchers working outside the Assyriological tradition entirely. Alan Bond, an aerospace engineer associated with Reaction Engines Limited in the United Kingdom, and Mark Hempsell, a spacecraft systems engineer formerly of Bristol University, became known in the alternative research community for their work on an entirely different cuneiform tablet. The so-called planisphere of Nineveh, catalogued as a specific Assyrian astronomical tablet held in room 55 of the British Museum. Bond and Hempsel are not fringe figures. Bond is an aerospace engineer who has worked on rocket propulsion systems. Hempsel is a spacecraft systems engineer who has worked with the European Space Agency. Their analysis of the planisphere of Nineveh, published in book form in 2008, argued that the astronomical observations recorded on the tablet placed a specific event on the morning of June 29th, 3123 BCE. The event they identified was an asteroid impact in what is now Austria, the Kofels event, which has been geologically dated to roughly the same period. That work is not the subject here. But it matters because Bond and Hempsel's methodology, treating cuneiform texts as records of observed events rather than as mythology, informed a wave of subsequent rereadings of other texts. The Era epic was among them. The methodology used in these rereadings is worth stating explicitly. Text is treated as a working hypothesis, as a record of something the original composers experienced or had inherited as memory. The named geographical locations are mapped against known sites. The named events are compared to the archaeological record at those sites. The named timings, where they can be reconstructed, are compared to radiocarbon and stratigraphic dating. Where the text and the archaeology converge, the convergence is noted. Where they diverge, the divergence is noted. The conclusion is not asserted in advance. Procedure is the same as that used by classical philologists reading Homer alongside the excavations of Hisarlik in the 1870s. The same method that, when Heinrich Schliemann applied it, revealed that what had been treated as pure myth was rooted in physical fact. The Iliad's Troy turned out to be in the ground. Mahabharata's Dwaraka turned out to be in the Gulf of Cambay. The Atrahasis flood narrative turned out to align with a verifiable Holocene sea level rise. The method is not new, and it is not fringe in its assumptions. What is contested is its application to this specific text. Finding, when the method is applied to the Era epic, is the following. The geography matches Ur-3 southern Mesopotamia. Pattern of destruction matches the archaeological signature of the Ur-3 collapse. Timing. If the events the poem describes are taken to occur approximately 1200 years before the tablets themselves were copied, matches the late 21st century BCE. The colophon's protective instruction on this reading is not a literary device. It is a residual instruction, copied forward by scribes who no longer knew what it had originally meant. The Era epic on this reading is the surviving manual. If this reading is substantially correct, the implications are significant. Most immediately, it would mean that the Mesopotamian scribal tradition preserved, across at least centuries, a coherent account of a real catastrophic event. Preserved it accurately enough that the geography and the pattern of destruction can still be matched to archaeological reality 3.5 millennia later. That is not the standard view of how oral and scribal tradition function. The standard view is that within a few generations, the historical core of an event is overwritten by literary and religious accretion, and what remains is myth in the technical sense. A story whose causes and consequences have been re-narrated according to the theological needs of each successive generation. The Era epic, on the alternative reading, is something else. It is a story whose theological framing has accreted on top of a still visible historical core, post. This matters because of what it would imply about the other major Mesopotamian texts. The Atrahasis epic, which tells the story of a flood sent by the gods to destroy a noisy and rebellious humanity, has long been recognized as the literary precursor of the Genesis flood narrative. The 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, held in the British Museum, and catalogued as one of the most famous cuneiform tablets in existence, contains a parallel flood account. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation narrative, contains cosmological material that has been read by some as referring to actual celestial events. If the Era epic preserves a historical core under its mythological framing, the question naturally arises whether these other compositions do as well. The Atrahasis flood may correspond to a real Holocene flood. The Gilgamesh flood may be the same event recorded a second time. The Enuma Elish's celestial battles may correspond to observable astronomical phenomena. Each of these connections has been argued by alternative researchers and rejected by mainstream Assyriology. The Era epic case is the strongest of them because its geography is so specific, its destruction sequence is so concrete, and its archaeological correspondence at Eridu, Larsa, Nippur, and the smaller satellite settlements is so unambiguous. The cities the Era epic names being destroyed are not vague poetic locations. They are real places, all of them excavated, all of them carrying archaeological evidence of abrupt abandonment in the late 3rd millennium BCE. Eridu, the oldest city in the Sumerian list, was excavated by Iraqi archaeologists in the 1940s and again in the 1960s, and was found to have been abandoned for approximately 1,000 years following the Ur-3 collapse. The city of Ur itself, excavated under Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, preserved a destruction layer datable to approximately 2004 BCE. Nippur, the religious centre of southern Mesopotamia, excavated by joint American and Iraqi expeditions across the 20th century, showed similar signatures. Lagash, Larsa, all of them carry the same archaeological story. The cities did not slowly decline. They were abandoned rapidly, within roughly 2 generations, and the agricultural land around them was abandoned with them. The mainstream explanation for this collapse remains contested. The most widely accepted theory is climate-driven, a shift toward aridity in the late 3rd millennium BCE, documented in lakebed sediment cores from the Levant and in pollen records from Iran and Anatolia. The shift, often referred to as the 4.2 kiloyear event, is real and is well attested across multiple paleoclimate proxies, may indeed be a sufficient explanation for the Ur-3 collapse. The salinization of irrigation systems is also real and well documented. Soil cores from the area south of modern Nasiriyah preserve a clear record of rising salinity in the relevant centuries. Amorite incursions recorded in late Ur-3 administrative documents are also real. There is no shortage of conventional mechanisms by which the Ur-3 empire could have fallen. The question raised by the Era epic and the Lamentations is not whether these mechanisms operated. The question is whether they fully account for what the contemporary witnesses described. What the contemporary witnesses described in the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur is an evil wind, a wind that burned, wind that killed without distinction, old and young, sacred and profane, animal and human, vegetation and water, wind that made the soil itself sterile for generations. The Lamentations are not literary effusions written long after the fact. The most widely accepted scholarly view, published by Pyotr Mikolovsky of the University of Michigan in his 1989 edition of the Lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, places the composition within approximately 50 years of the events themselves. The composers were not myth-makers working at a distance. They were the immediate descendants of the survivors. And what they described is not climate change. Climate change does not burn. Climate change does not sterilize soil within a single season. Climate change does not kill old and young indifferently within a single day. The descriptions in the Lamentations and the descriptions in the Era epic are descriptions of something else, something the witnesses tried to name in the only vocabulary they had, the vocabulary of divine action, of weapons wielded by gods, of fires that came down from the sky. If you want to check this yourself, the texts are available. Michalowski's edition is in print. Daly's translation of the Era Epic is in print. Cagney's Italian edition can be found in any major research library. Cuneiform tablets themselves can be examined by arrangement at the British Museum, the Iraq Museum, and the Yale Babylonian Collection. Catalogue is open. The argument can be checked by anyone who wants to check it. That is not a small matter. Contested claims in archaeology rest on inaccessible primary material. This one does not. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition was, by ancient standards, unusually concerned with preservation. Royal libraries of Nineveh, assembled under Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, contained tens of thousands of tablets, many of which were deliberate copies of older compositions. Colophons of these copies frequently record the scribe's name, the date of copying, the scribe's professional rank, and the source from which the copy was made. The scribal tradition treated accuracy as a religious duty. Tablets were checked against their exemplars. Variants were noted. The Era Epic, in this tradition, is one of the most copied texts. Fragments of it have been recovered not only from Nineveh, but from Sultan Tepe, from Assur, from Babylon, from Sippar, from at least one private house excavated at Uruk. Text was widely circulated and widely preserved. Whatever the colophon meant by promising protection to those who kept the text in their houses, the scribes took that promise seriously enough to act on it. The form of the academic response to this body of analysis has been, with a small number of exceptions, silence. Not refutation, silence. No counter-calculation has been published, showing that the geography of destruction in the Era Epic does not match Ur-3 southern Mesopotamia. No counter-analysis has been published demonstrating that the archaeological collapse layer at Eridu, Nippur, and the satellite cities is incompatible with the destruction sequence in the text. Published paper has engaged with the specific question of why the colophon explicitly frames the tablet as a survival instruction rather than as a generic protective amulet. Pattern that emerges when you look at the literature is that the alternative reading has not been refuted on its substantive points. It has been ignored. This matters because refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. The characterization most commonly applied to Sitchin's work is that he was an amateur who misread cuneiform. That characterization is partially accurate. Sitchin did make errors of translation, particularly in his earlier books, and some of those errors have been catalogued in detail by a Assyriologist writing for general audiences. The question is not whether Sitchin made errors. The question is whether the specific reading of the Era Epic he proposed, the geographical match, the temporal match, the alignment of the colophon with a real survival instruction, has been engaged with on its own merits. The honest answer is that it has not. The closest thing to substantive engagement appears in passing footnotes in academic translations, where the alternative reading is mentioned briefly, and then set aside as not requiring further comment. Footnote treatment is not refutation. It is a signal that the author considers the question closed without having argued for closure. This is the same pattern observed in other contested fields. The same pattern that surrounded Avi Loeb's recent proposals about anomalous interstellar objects, where Loeb, a Harvard astrophysicist, has documented in detail how the response to his published analyses has consisted of characterization rather than counter-calculation. Loeb's case is instructive, because he is, by every conventional measure, an establishment figure. He held the chair of the Harvard Astronomy Department for 9 years. His response to his own dismissal has been to publish more, in greater specificity, daring the establishment to engage on the technical merits. Some has engaged, most has not. The same dynamic is visible in the response to Robert Schoch, a Boston University geologist, whose analysis of the weathering patterns on the Sphinx at Giza led him to conclude that the monument is older than the conventional Egyptological dating. Schoch's geological work has not been refuted on the geology. The response has been characterization. That he is not an Egyptologist. That his conclusions threaten established chronology. That his interpretation is therefore not to be taken seriously. The geology stands. The dismissal continues. Mark Hempsel's analysis of the planisphere of Nineveh has been treated the same way. Specific astronomical calculations he and Alan Bond performed have not been published as wrong, they have simply been not addressed. The result is a strange asymmetry in the literature. On one side, a body of published analysis that takes specific texts and specific artifacts seriously, applies a defined methodology, and produces specific testable findings. On the other side, a body of mainstream scholarship that does not engage with the specific findings, but that, in textbooks and survey articles, continues to characterize the alternative work as not worth engaging with. A reader, looking at the literature for the first time, would be forgiven for assuming that the alternative work had been refuted, would assume. That is, that the mainstream characterization rests on substantive counter-argument. It does not. There is no counter-calculation in the published record showing that the era epic does not align with Earth-3 geography. There is no counter-stratigraphy showing that the destruction layers at the Sumerian cities are incompatible with the timing implied by the text. The case has not been argued on the merits, because the merits have not been engaged. Few exceptions should be acknowledged. Andrew George, the British Assyriologist, who produced the Penguin Classics edition of Gilgamesh, and a major edition of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic published in 2003, has written at length about the historicity of the Mesopotamian flood traditions, and has engaged seriously with the question of whether literary tradition preserves historical kernels. His conclusions are sceptical, but his engagement is substantive. Benjamin Foster, the Yale Assyriologist, has similarly engaged with questions of historicity in his anthology Before the Muses. These engagements exist. They are exceptions. They are also, notably, careful enough that the alternative researchers themselves have cited them respectfully. Breakdown in the conversation has not been on the side of the alternative work. The breakdown has been in the broader academic community's willingness to treat the alternative reading as a question still open. To understand what the era epic might be recording, it helps to understand what southern Mesopotamia was in the centuries before the Ur-3 collapse. The Sumerian civilization that flourished in the late 4th and 3rd millennia BCE was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most sophisticated urban cultures of the ancient world. Cities, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Larsa, and several dozen smaller settlements, were tied together by canals, by a shared written language, by a shared religion, by a shared economic system based on temple administration. The cities were enormous by ancient standards. Uruk, at its height in the 4th millennium BCE, may have housed 80,000 inhabitants. The walls of Uruk, attributed in the Gilgamesh epic to the legendary king Gilgamesh himself, can still be traced on the ground today. Ziggurat of Ur, built by Ur-Nammu in approximately 2100 BCE, still stands in modified form in southern Iraq, restored in the 20th century, but built on its original foundations. The Ur-3 Empire was the high point of Sumerian political organization. Namu, its founder, ruled from approximately 2112 BCE to 2095 BCE. His son Shulgi, who reigned for nearly 50 years, presided over what scholars consider the most administratively complex state of the ancient world, the Shulgi archives. Tens of thousands of administrative tablets recovered from Drehem, Umma, Girsu, and other Ura III administrative centres record state activity in a level of detail unmatched by any other early civilization. Sheep counts, beer rations, temple offerings, land grants, royal correspondence. The III state knew where every sheep was, every day. Scribal class supporting that administration was enormous, and the educational infrastructure that produced it. The Eduba, the tablet house, was one of the first institutionalized school systems known. Shulgi was succeeded by Amasin, who reigned approximately 2046 BCE to 2038 BCE, and by Shusin, his successor, who ruled approximately 2037 BCE to 2029 BCE. Final king of the dynasty was Ibisin, who came to the throne in approximately 2028 BCE. Within 15 years, the empire he had inherited from his fathers no longer existed. The southern cities ceased reporting to the central administration. The walls Shu Sin had built across northern Mesopotamia to keep out the Amorites had failed. The Elamites from the east had sacked itself in approximately 2004 BCE, taking Ibisin captive and ending the dynasty. The Lamentations were composed shortly after. The era epic, on the alternative reading, was composed much later, but draws on the same memory. The cosmology of these people, what they believed about the world and the gods, is important context for what the era epic actually says. The Sumerian and later Akkadian pantheons were not the orderly Olympian families of later Greek tradition. The gods of Mesopotamia were powerful, capricious, divided, and conducted long campaigns against each other and against humanity. An, the sky god, ruled distantly. Enlil, the storm god, was the active power in the world, and was the god most often described as ordering the destruction of cities. Enki, sometimes called Ea, was the god of wisdom and of the deep waters, and was usually the god who warned humans of coming disasters. The figure who, in the Atrahasis flood narrative, tipped off the human Atrahasis to build a boat. Marduk rose to chief god status in the Babylonian period. Nergal ruled the underworld and was associated with plague. Era was sometimes treated as a separate figure, sometimes as an aspect of Nergal. Shum was Era's herald, and in the Era epic is the voice of restraint. The Sabiti, the seven, are harder to place. They appear in incantation texts as both protective and destructive forces. They are sometimes identified as the seven sons of An. They are sometimes identified with specific stars or planets. They appear on cylinder seals as seven small figures, often armed, often standing in a row. In the Era epic, they are the agitators who awaken Era from his sleep and urge him toward destruction. Their speech in the poem is direct, specific, and disturbing. They tell Era that his weapons have grown dull from lack of use. They tell him that the people of the land have forgotten his power. They tell him that the noise of humanity has become unbearable to the gods. They demand action. Era resists, then agrees, then acts. This is the cosmological frame the original audience would have brought to the text. The destruction the poem describes was, for them, an event that had happened and could happen again. Colophon's promise of protection was not a literary flourish. It was an offer of insurance against a known risk. The scribes, who copied the tablet across 12 centuries, did so. On the alternative reading, because the risk had not been understood to have passed. Era in the poem sleeps. He does not die. The cycle remains open. Physical setting of southern Mesopotamia in the centuries surrounding the III collapse is reconstructible in some detail. Tigris and the Euphrates ran further south then than they do now, and the Persian Gulf extended further inland. Marshes of southern Iraq, still visible today in modified form, were larger and more productive in the 3rd millennium BCE. The land between the rivers was cultivated through a vast system of canals, maintained by state corvée labour, and produced wheat, barley, dates, sesame, and the wool that drove the textile economy. Sheep and goats grazed the land between the cultivated zones. Donkeys and oxen worked the fields and pulled the carts. Boats moved continuously up and down the canals, carrying grain to the temples and goods from the Persian Gulf trade north to Akkadian and, later, Assyrian markets. The cities themselves were dense, walled, dusty and noisy. The temples, the ziggurats, rose from the centres of the settlements as artificial mountains, each city dedicated to a particular god, each ziggurat the focus of the city's identity. The temple staff were enormous. At in the 21st century BCE, the temple complex of Nana, the moon god, employed several thousand people directly, with thousands more in supporting roles. The economy ran through the temple. Land was owned by the temple. Production was administered by the temple. Kings, even at their most powerful, ruled in partnership with the temple administration rather than over it. This is the world that, according to the Lamentations and according to the era epic, was burned. The descriptions are graphic. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and describes the storehouses of the cities standing empty. It describes the canals running with no boats. It describes the temples standing without their gods, because the gods had abandoned the cities before the disaster came. It describes the bodies in the streets, unburied, because there were not enough living to bury them. It describes the smell. The smell in the text is one of the most disturbing details. The writer specifies that the smell of the unburied dead persisted in the cities for years, and that this smell was the lasting signature of the disaster, the thing that survivors associated most strongly with what had happened. The conventional explanation that the disaster was caused by Amorite incursion combined with climate change and salinization has to account for these descriptions. The standard view is that the descriptions are poetic exaggerations of a real but more gradual decline. Bodies in the streets become a literary trope rather than a literal census. The lasting smell becomes a symbol rather than a sensory record. This may be correct. It is also possible to read the descriptions as literal and to ask what kind of event would produce them. Climate change does not produce bodies in the streets in a single season. Climate change does not leave cities unburied because there are not enough living to bury the dead. Whatever happened at the 3 collapse, on the literal reading of the texts, was abrupt, severe, and broadly distributed across the southern Mesopotamian heartland. Conventional mechanisms can explain a gradual decline. They strain to explain what the contemporary witnesses claim to have observed. The Mesopotamian scribes, who preserved the era epic, were not naive observers. They were among the most educated people of the ancient world. They were trained in mathematics, in astronomy, in law, in literature, in medicine. The texts they copied alongside the era epic include treatises on the prediction of eclipses, calendars accurate to the day, medical handbooks listing symptoms and treatments with a precision that compares favourably to early modern European medicine. The astronomical diaries kept at Babylon from the 8th century BCE onward record planetary positions with such accuracy that modern astronomers have used them to reconstruct ancient eclipses and to date events in classical history. These were not credulous people. They understood what counted as observation and what counted as inference. When they copied the era epic, they did so within a culture that valued accuracy of transmission above almost any other intellectual virtue. Short biography of a few key figures from this period helps anchor the story. Namu, the founder of the Ur-3 dynasty, came to power approximately 2112 BCE, after the brief overlordship of Utu-Hegel of Uruk. Namu's law code, recovered from cuneiform fragments and dating to approximately 2100 BCE, is the oldest surviving law code in human history, predating the Code of Hammurabi by approximately 3 centuries. Code addresses property disputes, marriage law, false testimony, and bodily harm. It is recognizably the same kind of document as the Code of Hammurabi, which sits in the Louvre, in the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities, and which Ur-Nammu's code is sometimes read alongside. Shulgi, Ur-Nammu's son, reigned approximately 2094 BCE to 2047 BCE. He divinized himself during his lifetime, a rare and significant move in Mesopotamian political theory. He centralized the administration. He standardized weights and measures. He built schools and roads. The administrative archives from his reign are, as already noted, of extraordinary detail. Shulgi is, in the historical record, exactly the kind of king whose legacy the era epic would invoke as the high point of the world that was lost. His name appears in later king lists, including the Weld Blundell Prism, the Sumerian king list held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which gives him a reign of 46 years and a series of impressive epithets. Sin, the last of the Thuri king, ruled from approximately 2028 BCE. His reign began with the empire intact. By his 5th year, the eastern Elamite buffer was breaking down. By his 8th year, the northern Amorite frontier had collapsed. Fost. By his 15th year, the southern cities had stopped sending tribute. By his 23rd year, in approximately 2004 BCE, the Elamites entered Ur, sacked it, and carried Ibisin himself east to Anshan in chains. The empire was over. The Lamentations were composed shortly after, attributed by tradition to scribes who had witnessed the events directly. The era epic, on the alternative reading, was composed many centuries later, but drew on the same body of memory. This is the world. This is what the era epic claims to have recorded. The descriptions specific enough that they can be checked against archaeology. The geography is detailed enough that the cities can be located. Timing is precise enough that the events, if they occurred, can be dated. Colophon is unusual enough that it demands an explanation, and the conventional explanation, that it is a standard amulet formula, does not fully account for its specific framing as a survival instruction for an event that the poem itself describes in detail. What strengthens this reading further is that it is not unique to Mesopotamia. Pattern of preserved destruction memory, framed as instruction to later generations, appears in cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamian scribal tradition, the clearest example, and the one most often paired with the era epic in the alternative literature, comes from the Indian subcontinent. The Mahabharata, the great Sanskrit epic, contains in its 11th book, the Mausala Parva, the Book of the Iron Club, a description of the destruction of the Vrishni clan that has long puzzled mainstream Indologists. The destruction is sudden, comprehensive, and described in terms that do not match the kind of warfare depicted elsewhere in the epic. The text describes an iron object falling from the sky. It describes the disintegration of bodies. It describes a stench that lingered. It describes the abandonment of the city of Dwaraka, which sank into the sea shortly after. Dwaraka, in the conventional view, was a literary city. Then, in the 1980s and 1990s, the Indian Marine Archaeology Unit, under the direction of S.R. Rao, conducted underwater surveys in the Gulf of Cambay, off the coast of modern Dwarka in Gujarat. They found a submerged settlement, The dating of the submerged structures remains contested, but the existence of the site is not. The Mahabharata's Dwaraka is in the ground, under the water, where the text said it was. Mausala Parva's description of the destruction predates by millennia the modern ability to verify any of its claims. The conventional reading treats it as poetic invention. The alternative reading treats it as preserved memory of a real event. Narrated through the cosmological vocabulary the original observers had access to, the Drona Parva, the seventh book of the Mahabharata, contains an even more specific passage describing a weapon called the Brahmastra. The descriptions in the Drona Parva of what the Brahmastra did when deployed. The brightness, the heat, the wind, the long-term sterility of the land, the falling out of hair and nails among survivors, were noted in the 1940s by figures including Julius Robert Oppenheimer himself, who is widely reported to have referenced the Bhagavad Gita at the Trinity test in 1945. Parallel between the Sanskrit descriptions and modern nuclear effects has been remarked on by alternative researchers ever since. The mainstream explanation is coincidence, that the descriptions are poetic, generic enough to match many kinds of catastrophe, and that the apparent specificity is a projection backward from modern knowledge. That explanation is plausible. It is not, however, the only plausible reading. Descriptions in the Drona Parva and the Mausala Parva have a specificity that resists generic interpretation. They name the weapon. They describe its deployment. They describe its effects in sequence. They describe its aftermath. The aftermath section is what most resembles the descriptions in the Sumerian Lamentations and in the Era epic. The same details, the wind, the long-term land sterility, the unburied dead, the lingering stench, the regional abandonment, appear in two literary traditions separated by thousands of kilometres and at least a millennium of compositional history. The mainstream explanation invokes shared mythological inheritance from a hypothetical Indo-European stratum. The alternative explanation, less elegant but more direct, is that the two traditions are describing the same kind of event, observed in two different times and places, by two different sets of witnesses who reached for the same vocabulary, because the vocabulary was the only one they had. Third parallel comes from the Hebrew tradition. The Book of Enoch, preserved most fully in GEs in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, contains in its first book descriptions of antediluvian destruction that have been read by alternative researchers as preserving the same memory pattern. Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, divine beings who descended to the earth, who taught humanity forbidden knowledge, and whose actions led to a destruction by water and by fire. The text is, by any account, ancient. Fragments of it have been recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, dating the composition to no later than the 3rd century BCE and possibly considerably earlier. The Book of Enoch's relationship to the canonical Hebrew Bible is complicated. It is cited in the New Testament, in the Epistle of Jude. It was preserved in Ethiopian Christian tradition when it was lost in the Western canon. It came back into Western scholarly attention in the late 18th century, when the Scottish traveller James Bruce brought manuscripts back from Ethiopia in the 1770s. Watchers of the Book of Enoch parallel the Anunnaki of Mesopotamian tradition in specific ways. They are described as descended divine beings. They are described as having taught humanity skills: metallurgy, weapons making, cosmetics, astronomy, medicine. They are described as having been confined or destroyed when their teaching was deemed to have crossed a line. Parallels are not generic. They are specific in their content and in their sequence. The conventional explanation invokes shared Near Eastern mythological background. The alternative explanation invokes preserved historical memory of the same set of events, narrated through different cultural lenses. Fourth, and perhaps the most striking parallel, comes from the Popol Vuh, the Quiche Mayan creation narrative, preserved in a 16th century transcription of an oral tradition whose roots are demonstrably much older. Popol Vuh describes successive creations of humanity, each destroyed by the gods when humanity proved unsatisfactory. The third creation is destroyed by a flood, paralleling the Mesopotamian and Hebrew flood traditions. The descriptions are specific, sequential, and difficult to reconcile with the conventional view that the Popol Vuh derives from purely local Mesoamerican tradition without contact with the Old World narratives. The mainstream view invokes either independent invention or post-conquest contamination. The alternative view invokes preserved memory of the same events, by witnesses on a different continent, in a different vocabulary. The Hopi creation traditions of the American Southwest preserve a similar structure of successive worlds, each destroyed by the gods, each followed by a remnant of survivors who carried instructions forward into the next world. Hopi traditions include specific instructions for recognizing the signs of the destruction of the present world. Instructions that, like the colophon of the Era epic, function as a survival manual. Traditions are preserved orally and were not transcribed in detail until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, by ethnographers including H. R. Voth and later Frank Waters. The traditions are demonstrably ancient. Convergence with the Mesopotamian and Hebrew patterns is on its face remarkable. These parallels do not prove the alternative reading of the Era epic cast. They do, however, raise the question that the alternative reading raises directly. Multiple unrelated cultures preserved the same destruction narrative in the same sequence, with the same instruction for survivors, framing what is the most economical explanation. The mainstream answer, that it is coincidence reinforced by shared Indo-European or Near Eastern mythological background, is not unreasonable. It is also not the only available answer. The alternative answer, that the parallel preservation reflects parallel observation of similar events, is unconventional but not incoherent. Question is, which explanation accounts for the specificity of the parallels more economically? The strongest counter-argument to the entire reading proposed here is worth stating in detail, because the strength of any contested claim is most fairly judged against the strength of its best opposition. Most serious objection is one developed in the literature on Mesopotamian protective texts, most fully by Erica Reiner, the late University of Chicago Assyriologist, and continued in the work of her students and successors. The objection is this: Mesopotamian protective texts as a class, apotropaic incantations, Namburbi rituals, Lamashtu amulets, Sherpu and Maklu series, frequently include closing formulas promising protection to those who possess or recite them. The Era Epic's colophon, on this reading, is one example of a well-attested formula type, and does not need to be explained by reference to a specific historical event. Protective formula is generic. It is found across hundreds of texts. The Era Epic happens to use it. Reading anything more into it overreads the evidence. This is a serious objection. Body of comparative material Reiner and her successors assembled is substantial. Protective formulas in question are real, and they do recur across the Mesopotamian apotropaic corpus. The conventional reading is not unsupported. What it does not, however, account for is the specificity of the Era Epic's framing. Colophon does not simply promise protection, promises protection specifically against the destruction described in the body of the text. The text describes a specific kind of catastrophe, fire from above, The withering of vegetation, the contamination of waters, the regional depopulation. The colophon promises protection against that specific catastrophe. This is not the typical pattern of generic apotropaic protection. The typical pattern offers protection against a wide range of unspecified harms. The era epic colophon is unusually targeted. The mainstream response to this point, where it is made at all, is that the targeting reflects the literary unity of the composition rather than any underlying historical reference. The author of the poem chose to make his closing formula match his thematic content. This is a coherent reply. It is also, on the alternative reading, exactly the kind of unfalsifiable hypothesis that resists empirical evaluation. The closing formula matches the thematic content because the author was a careful literary craftsman, then no specific match between text and event can ever count as evidence of historical preservation. Because the match can always be reattributed to authorial craft. This is not a counter-argument. It is a methodological choice. Question is whether the choice is the right one. The state of the debate, honestly described, is that it remains genuinely unresolved. Mainstream literary craft explanation is internally coherent and supported by parallels within the apotropaic corpus. The alternative historical preservation explanation is internally coherent and supported by parallels across distinct cultural traditions. Neither has been refuted by the other. Neither has produced a decisive empirical test. The texts are in the ground. The artifacts are in the museums. The archaeology is what it is. Missing is the willingness on the part of the mainstream to treat the alternative as a question still worth engaging. If the alternative reading is substantially correct, the consequences for conventional history are significant but bounded. The Sumerian civilization was real and is not in doubt. The Earth 3 collapse was real and is not in doubt. What would change is the explanation of the collapse. From a slow climate and political process to an abrupt event of a kind not currently recognized in the conventional framework. The implications for adjacent texts would follow: the Atrahasis flood, the Gilgamesh flood, the Enuma Elish's cosmological battles, the Lamentations, all would acquire a new status, neither pure myth nor strictly historical, but something in between, a preserved memory filtered through the cosmological vocabulary of the cultures that received it. The era epic is real, its colophon is real. The cities it names being destroyed are in the archaeological record where the text says they should be. Question of what destroyed them, and what the colophon was trying to warn against, is still open. The tablets are in the British Museum. The Iraq Museum holds significant fragments. The Suleymaniya Museum holds others. Published translations by Cagni and Dali are available in any major research library. The Sumerian Lamentations, in Mikhailovsky's edition and in others, are similarly available. The cuneiform itself can be examined by any researcher who applies for access. Catalogue is open. Zechariah Sitchin's analysis was published in his books and remains in print. Mark Hempsel and Alan Bond's astronomical work on the related cuneiform record was published in book form. The work is available to any reader who wants to check it. Post. What the Mesopotamian scribes copied across 12 centuries, and what they were trying to warn their descendants about, is still open. It has been open since Layard and Rassam dug the first fragments out of the ground in the 1840s and 1850s. It is still open now.